Actually, that was part 4. This is part 5. We're just about through with this part. Um, there were two more explorations I want to look at before we quit. They're further down the road, and once again, they're in the same time frame. In this case, from 1539 to 42. I have to set the thing up. Um, Odd little story. The 1528, I think it was, a number over 100 uh, Spaniards are shipwrecked on an island in the Gulf. Which one? Could very well have been Galveston Island. Anyway, they have between 100 and 150 survivors of a shipwreck, and they're taken in by a local Indian tribe known as the Karankawas, spelled with K's, and they were later reputed to be cannibalistic. I suspect that really was a myth invented to justify their extermination, which happened 300 years later. Anyway, they were put to work as farm workers and not being, you know, adjusted to the climate. They're dropping like flies. And a half a dozen or so of them realized, we don't get out of this place, we're going to die here, we'd rather not. And they somehow made their escape and wandered around for 7 years. They didn't know where they were, so we don't know where they were either. We know the names of, I think, 2 of them. One of them was named Esteban. They called him Esteban the Moor. The word Moor could apply to a Muslim, more likely to a black man. And the one who's most famous, because he's the one who wrote up a full account of it later after he returned to civilization, was named Alvar Nunez. You've never heard of Alvar Nunez, but you might have heard of him by an odd title that had been passed down in his family, his male line, for 6 generations, and no one has yet come up with an explanation of what this is about. But the title was Cabeza de Vaca, head of a cow. I don't know, go figure. Anyway, um, they encountered various Indian tribes. They're all, if it's Galveston they started from, Texas, probably some of Oklahoma, Kansas, maybe Colorado, New Mexico, and they're sort of passed along from one Indian tribe to another, and they became like rock stars. That there'd be flowers strewn in their path and be treated with great hospitality. Part of it was because Esteban had figured out that he could lay hands on sick people and heal them. Now, if that's what I did for a living, I wouldn't hang around that long either. But according to Cabeza de Vaca, this strains the boundaries of belief. They performed a successful appendectomy. They opened a patient, removed an appendix, closed the patient, and the patient lived, at least for the time being. That's how it is. Finally, around 1535, they made contact with some Spanish soldiers in what's now northern Mexico. Well, Cabeza de Vaca proceeded to write up a story of all this, which he entitled Naufragios, or Shipwrecks. There's some things in there that caught the attention of the Spanish. He reported that the Indians they had stayed among had told them of a very wealthy country called Quivira, spelled Q-U-I, Quivira, somewhere to the north. And located in Quivira was a fabulously wealthy city called Cibola, where they didn't just have gold, the whole city was built out of the stuff. Okay, haven't found that yet. And of course, the rumor mill being what it is, that's quickly multiplied into the 7 golden cities of Cibola. All right, this seed falls on fertile ground, because one thing I ran out of time and didn't tell you about the Cortez expedition at the end of the last video. Why the Spanish refocused their attention? For one thing, Magellan shows it's too far around, but Cortez observes that the Indians they're visiting are wearing ornaments. They're made of gold and silver. That will get your attention. And since they practice human sacrifice, meaning they obviously ain't Catholics, that would justify taking them over. Well, it wasn't until the 1530s that they discovered where the gold and silver was coming from. So the Spanish acquired the rich gold and silver mines of what's now southern Mexico. And they worked them out, but played them out. It took 120 years. Of the same decade, a much smaller expedition, the Pizarro expedition, overcame the Incas down in Peru in northern South America. They were at least as rich as the Aztecs were. So, wow. From then on, for the next more than a century, once a year, a fleet of really big ships called galleons stuffed full of gold and silver coins, they made it into coins on site, would go wallering out across the Atlantic headed for Spain. This was a river of gold and silver flowing into the Spanish economy and from there into the European economy. And of course, it set off inflation. Nobody understood it. They didn't know what was going on. Their economic ideas made no place for it, but it's estimated that 16,000 tons of silver made its way to Spain and 200 tons of gold. Now, silver and gold is what money was physically made out of, so it would have value. Until not that long ago, money was worth something because it was made out of valuable stuff. Coinage was real money. Paper was substitute. I'll leave that for another day. So, you've heard things come in threes? Well, here it is. You got the one in Mexico, you got the one in Peru, and if we could find Quivira, we'd strike it rich. So this has to be checked out. In the late 1530s, a small expedition went north to see if they could find confirmation of this. The leader was a priest known to us as Fray Marcos, and Esteban went along as a guide. Now, Esteban sadly perished on this journey, but they came back reporting that they had actually seen a golden city glistening in the distance. Of course, they also brought back the information that land is very arid and very dry, and an army going north would have to scatter out because there's not enough water in any one place for them all to get a nice, deep, cool drink of water. So the result was the Coronado expedition, 1539 to 42, 20 years after the ones I told you about earlier. In charge was Francisco Coronado, the viceroy of Nueva España itself, now known as New Spain or Mexico. Okay, several hundred troops and assorted support personnel marched north, trying to stay together. And they marched around through Texas and the Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma, some of them in Kansas, New Mexico, maybe Arizona, certainly Arizona. They split into two groups for a while. They discovered some things. I'm guessing about this one. Wouldn't you say they probably discovered that armor made of metal is a little bit hot to wear in Texas in the summertime? Well, I'm going to give them a pass on that. They discovered some real estate so utterly flat and featureless, ever been to the Texas Panhandle, that you practically have to be skilled in ocean navigation not to lose your way. So they were obliged to drive sticks in the ground periodically so they could at least find their way back from where they come from, because all the directions look alike. I've been out there. And to this day, that region is known as the Llano Estacado, the staked plain. They discovered wild wheat growing in Kansas. Some of them discovered the Grand Canyon. Can you imagine walking up on that when you're not prepared? Long way around. They discovered that not all the Indians could be trusted. One tribe, I think in New Mexico, one of them volunteered to guide them to Quivira. Come on with me, I'll show you where Quivira is. Okay, let's go. And he led them up into what's now Kansas. Turns out Quivira was Kansas. Okay, no gold. So the Spanish realized they'd been played, and they strangled the Indian, whom they called the Turk, for his efforts. But he had succeeded in his mission, and that was getting these strangers as far away from his homies as he could. And they discovered some mud dwellings in what's now New Mexico, pueblos. The people are that's not the name of the tribe, Zuñis, I think, but the pueblos. They almost look like modern dwellings, and I suspect they're made out of mud, adobe. If you're on the west side of a pueblo right about sundown, and the golden rays of the sundown are reflecting off the mud walls of the pueblo, it could look like it was made of gold. So that probably explains it as anything else could. Now, Fray Marcos and his men said they didn't actually go up to the place, but they saw it from a distance. So Coronado and his survivors went back to Mexico bankrupt and discredited. Now, even if you were to side with the would-be conquerors, you can kind of give them a pass because what's out there? How many people could live in Arizona or New Mexico without air conditioning and deep well irrigation? The other expeditions, same time frame, 1539 to 42, is the De Soto expedition. Hernando de Soto is kind of the leader in being credited with discovering the Mississippi River. That's not really clear. And he's trekking around Louisiana, maybe Arkansas, Mississippi, out in that area. We don't know exactly where. Large expedition. And De Soto was a very angry, bitter, driven man who was convinced that the Indians had huge stockpiles of gold and silver, and they're hiding it from him. How's he supposed to steal it if they're hiding it from him? Well, they didn't get along with the Indians. By the way, these men were the first and the last Europeans to see in its natural, unspoiled condition the population, the culture now known as the Mississippians. Coronado was killed in a skirmish with the Indians, and his men tied stones around it and submerged it in the Mississippi River so the Indians would not discover that he was not, after all, the immortal sun god he told them he was. Oops. And they gave up, went back to the island they'd come from, arguing among themselves whether they might have stayed longer. And you wonder if they're blind. Okay? They were looking for the kind of wealth that you can loot and pillage and haul off in a sack. Wealth in the form of incredibly deep, rich topsoil, ample rainfall, a long growing season, excellent harbors, rivers, navigable rivers, penetrating far inland, endless, limitless stands of prime timber, a land that could be the seat of a wealthy and powerful nation. They're apparently blind to that. So they just retreated. So from then on, Spain showed relatively little interest. They didn't have the human resources. Now, the English, more and more coming all the time, they got human resources. The Spanish never really did. So they claimed much more than they could really maintain. Anyway, you had a short-lived settlement near where the city on the coast of Florida up in the Panhandle. I forget, in the 1560s, they got there just in time for a hurricane about wipe them out, gave up on that. They set up a fort on the Atlantic coast of Florida in the 1570s called St. Augustine. It is still there. It happens to be the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in continental United States. In the next century, they set up Santa Fe, New Mexico, and a way station at El Paso del Norte on the way up there. This was Santa Fe dates from 1610. That's only 3 years after the English settlement at Jamestown. When the Spanish showed some interest in the Mississippi Valley region in the 1680s, the Spanish hastily set up some missions up there to try to Hispanicize the Indians, but wherever the Spanish or Europeans in general went, they would carry European diseases and wipe out the Indians. So the missions were eventually, in the year 1718, withdrawn to a cluster around San Antonio, Texas. That's how that started. Okay. So check in the supplement about something called the Columbian Exchange. This is how plant life forms and so forth from the two worlds influence each other, and what farm crops were American and have gone global. Crops and things, animals from Europe have come to America. So that's pretty interesting. So make sure you're up on that. Hint, hint, hint. Okay, we're going to come back and turn our attention to English colonization.